All right, good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here. My name is Scott Arietta. I'm the founder and CEO of Unity and Company. And Unity is a leadership development and culture transformation firm, and we help organizations to build strong leaders, healthy teams, and cultures where people can do their best work. We work with companies across sectors, including fast growing startups, global enterprises, educational systems, and most importantly, mission driven organizations. Now, everything we do is grounded in research and real world experience, and a belief that leadership development is not just a business activity, it's a human one. Now, we host these executive forums for a simple reason, and that's because leaders today are struggling with dealing with challenges that are far more complex than even 5 years ago. Expectations are higher, the pace is faster, and automation has introduced an entirely new set of pressures. Yet, through all of that, the one thing that every organization needs, regardless of industry or scale, is leadership that actually brings out the best in people. Leadership that is steady and thoughtful and self aware and capable of guiding teams through uncertainty. Now, these forums exist to give you research, tools, frameworks, and perspectives that you can put immediately into practice in your role. So, today's topic is human leadership in a digital world, and it's about what it means to lead when AI, automation, and digital technology are rewriting the rules of work. Now, this shift is not theoretical or exaggerated. McKinsey's Global Institute reported that recent advances in generative AI have accelerated the automation timeline by almost a decade, particularly in knowledge based work. Now, Microsoft's Work Trend Index found that close to 70% of employees feel that AI is increasing expectations rather than decreasing their workload. And Gartner has reported a marked rise in digital exhaustion and emotional depletion as organizations introduce new systems faster than people can adapt to them. Now, this is not just industry insights. They're day to day realities for many of the leaders and teams that we work with here at Unity. And so, what all of this tells us is that while technology is advancing rapidly, human beings are not evolving at the same speed. Our nervous systems, our ability to process change, our tolerance for uncertainty, and our emotional bandwidth are still governed by ancient biology. And the more complex our digital environment becomes, the more leadership becomes distinctly a human practice. And so that is the tension at the center of today's conversation. And the theme we'll come back to throughout this session is that leadership in this new era requires the integration of two domains: the inner domain and the outer domain. And at Unity, we call this unified leadership. It's the joining of the inner game, which includes emotional regulation, presence, self-awareness, clarity, and grounded decision-making, with the outer game, which includes strategy, communication, systems thinking, performance management, and the ability to actually execute. Now, technology may change the outer tools that we use, but the inner part of leadership has never been more important than it is today. In fact, it has become the multiplier that determines whether teams feel clarity or confusion, whether they feel trust or fear, whether they feel alignment or just fragmentation. And so my goal today is to show you why emotional intelligence, psychological safety, and human presence, they're not just soft skills, but they're actually power skills. They're the very skills that we need to perform as leaders in today's era. And I want to give you a clear narrative that connects the neuroscience, the organizational research, and the real leadership practice into a coherent model for leading effectively in a digital world. And I want to leave you with practical guidance that you can use in the next 90 days to improve how you lead during this period of rapid technological change. So let's begin with the first big idea that sets the foundation for everything else that we'll discuss today. And that is that technology is accelerating faster than human capacity. Okay, so as we begin this conversation, I want to ground us in the first big idea that frames everything else that we'll cover today. So, that idea that technology is accelerating faster than human capacity. And this is not a philosophical statement, it's a measurable reality across every industry. So, the World Economic Forum's most recent Future of Jobs report highlights that technological adoption is moving at what they describe as an unprecedented rate, with 75% of companies planning to integrate AI tools more deeply into their operations within the next 5 years. And at the same time, The OECD has raised concerns about what it calls the adaptation gap, which is the widening divide between how fast organizations implement new technologies and how fast the workforce can develop the skills, mindsets, and emotional resilience needed to work effectively with the new tools. Now, this gap is not caused by resistance to change. It's caused by the limits of human cognitive and emotional bandwidth. So, researchers studying digital transformation have found that when employees face too many simultaneous system changes, productivity initially drops by as much as 20%. And MIT's Center for Information Systems Research also found that organizations underestimate the cognitive load of technological change, and often they misjudge how much context switching, confusion, and rework occurs during the learning curve. And these disruptions are not simply operational. They create emotional strain. They create self-doubt. They increase uncertainty. They trigger questions about identity and relevance. And so, in other words, they are deeply human responses to rapid externally imposed change. And this helps explain why so many leaders today describe feeling like they're stretched thin. It also explains why teams sometimes struggle during long periods of innovation. We often assume that technology removes effort, yet evidence suggests the opposite, at least in the short term. Technology multiplies inputs before it multiplies outputs. It increases communication volume. It increases decision-making moments. It increases the speed at which expectations shift. It increases the number of tools that people must learn just to stay current with their daily jobs. And so researchers at Stanford and Carnegie Mellon have examined the effects of digital acceleration on stress levels and attention. And their findings align with what we actually see in practice, which is when the pace of change exceeds the pace of adaptation, the nervous system interprets the environment as unpredictable, and that unpredictability activates what psychologists call a threat response, even when the change is positive or strategically important. So this response can look like withdrawal, irritability, defensiveness, and cognitive fatigue. It can also look like leaders who default to urgency, who default to shortcuts or command-style decision-making because their own capacity is overwhelmed. And so this dynamic is not about leadership failure. It's about the biology of human beings in environments that shift faster than our systems are built to process. When organizations adopt new technology at a rapid pace, leaders become the regulating force in a system that is under strain. So their ability to absorb complexity, to interpret change, and to create clarity determines whether their teams feel grounded or whether they feel destabilized. So when leaders respond reactively, teams pick up that same pattern. And when leaders respond with steady presence, teams find their footing faster. And so this brings us to the core insight of big idea number one, which is the rate of technological change will continue to rise. Human capacity will just not increase at the same rate. And so this means that the new differentiator in leadership is not technical knowledge. It's the ability to stay regulated, calm, and emotionally steady while guiding others through uncertainty. The leaders who can do that will outperform in environments where volatility is quickly becoming the norm. Now, with that foundation in place, we can now explore what automation and AI actually change about the work of leadership and why this shift requires a new understanding of how leaders create clarity and alignment. Okay, so now that we've established the acceleration gap between technology and human capacity, I want to shift into what automation actually changes about the work of leadership. So many leaders assume that the rise of AI only affects technical roles or operational workflows, but research actually shows that the most significant impact is on how leaders have to think, how they have to communicate, and how they have to guide teams through emotional responses to change. So let's start with what we know from the London School of Economics. And their ongoing work on technological disruption. So the researchers have found that automation reduces routine work, but increases what they call interpretive work. Now, interpretive work is the part of leadership that requires sense making. It requires meaning making and emotional grounding. And when technology takes over what once were predictable tasks, humans are left feeling, or they're left contending with work that is just more ambiguous. And so leaders spend more time synthesizing information, deciding what matters, and helping teams to navigate the complexity. And so this shift fundamentally redefines the role of a leader. So historically, leadership models emphasized information control and oversight and task level supervision. But in an AI enabled environment, information is no longer scarce. So the bottleneck actually becomes interpretation, clarity, and alignment, not the information itself. And so Harvard's Linda Hill describes this as the move from managing work to orchestrating systems. And leaders are no longer the people who know the most. They're the people who can connect the most. They can make sense of the most. They can communicate the most in the most clear way. And automation also changes the speed at which decisions need to be made. So a study from the University of Toronto found that AI-enabled teams encounter more decision points per day than traditional teams because automation accelerates the inputs. So this can increase strategic opportunities, sure, but it can also increase the emotional load on employees. The number of times that people have to shift focus, reconsider assumptions, or adjust to new information just rises significantly. And so when leaders do not offer clarity or context, then confusion scales faster than productivity. Another change involves the emotional landscape of work. So the Pew Research Center reported that more than 60% of workers who are exposed to automation express concerns about job security or long-term relevance. And the fear is not always explicit. It often shows up as friction, as hesitation, perfectionism, or even avoidance. And so even highly capable employees can experience a quiet form of identity threat that affects their confidence. So this means that leaders must be able to read emotional signals quickly and respond with presence rather than pressure. In companies that recognize this dynamic, they're seeing different results than their peer groups. So research from Accenture indicates that organizations that pair technological investment with strong human-centered leadership outperform their peers on productivity and retention. And their findings also emphasize that the human experience during technological change is the determining factor, whether automation accelerates performance or whether it just introduces friction. So all of this brings us to a key insight for leaders, which is that automation changes the tasks that your team performs, but it also changes what they need from you as a result. They need more clarity, not less. They need more communication, not less. They need stronger emotional steadiness and not more speed. And this is why research across multiple institutions points to a very clear conclusion with regards to all of this, that the human elements of leadership become more valuable, not less valuable, as technology advances. And this leads naturally to the next section of our conversation. If automation is reshaping what leadership requires, then we need to examine what actually creates performance in a world where human capacity is the new strategic asset. And that brings us to the next big idea, which is that emotional intelligence is no longer a soft skill. It is a performance multiplier. All right, so now that we understand how automation reshapes the work of leadership, we need to look directly at what drives performance in this new environment. So this brings us to our second big idea. And that's that emotional intelligence is not a soft skill, it's a performance multiplier. And the evidence for this is stronger today than at any point in the past 20 years. So let's start with what researchers mean when they talk about emotional intelligence. So Dan Goleman's work, which laid the foundation for modern EQ research, identifies four primary components: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. And for a long time, organizations treated these as desirable but optional. What has changed is the amount of data showing that these capabilities have a material impact on performance, especially in environments that are shaped by uncertainty, by rapid change, and cognitive overload. So one of the clearest examples comes from a meta-analysis published by the Journal of Organizational Behavior. And so researchers reviewed over 100 independent studies and found that emotional intelligence predicts job performance as strongly as, and in some contexts even more strongly than, IQ or technical skill. And the reason here is simple because when environments are stable, technical skill dominates. But when environments are volatile, human behavior dominates. And EQ determines how leaders show up under pressure, how teams respond to them, and how effectively people can collaborate when complexity rises. Another powerful data point comes from Google's Project Aristotle. So, when Google conducted a multi year study to identify what differentiated their highest performing teams, the top characteristics were not technical at all. They were emotional and relational. The teams that excelled had leaders who listened well, who demonstrated empathy, and they created psychological safety. And psychological safety alone accounted for more predictive power than all other team factors combined. And so Harvard's Amy Edmondson, who pioneered research on psychological safety, has shown that teams with high psychological safety outperform in adaptability, innovation, and problem solving because people feel safe to surface risks. They feel safe to admit uncertainty, and they share emerging insights before problems escalate. And so this matters even more in the context of automation as AI takes over routine work. So the remaining human work involves what psychologists call interdependent tasks. So these are the tasks that require coordination, collaboration, and mutual influence. And so these tasks succeed or fail based on emotional intelligence. Teams adopt new tools faster when they trust their leaders. And employees take more ownership when they feel understood. So people commit to change when they feel valued and supported and not pressured. So neuroscience research supports this as well. So studies by Dr. Richard Boyatsi at Case Western Reserve University have shown that leaders who activate what he calls the positive emotional attractor in their interactions generate stronger engagement and resilience in their teams. And this attractor is created through empathy, through genuine curiosity, and a sense of shared purpose. It stimulates the parts of the brain associated with openness, problem solving, and long-term thinking. And so when leaders activate the opposite, the negative emotional attractor, which is linked to fear or criticism, then cognitive capacity actually narrows. People shift into short-term survival thinking and lose access to creativity and flexible judgment. And these findings explain why EQ is so closely tied to performance. It affects how quickly teams learn, how they respond to setbacks, and how they handle the emotional demands of rapid technological change. And so in an AI-driven environment where ambiguity is constant, emotional intelligence becomes the stabilizing force that allows technical systems to work as intended. And this brings us to the next part of our discussion. If emotional intelligence is a performance multiplier, we need to understand what interferes with it. Why do leaders lose access to their emotional intelligence under pressure, and what can they even do about it? So to answer that, we need to look at the neuroscience of stress, uncertainty, and human behavior in the workplace, and that's where we're going to go next. Okay, so to understand why emotional intelligence becomes harder to access under pressure, we actually need to explore what happens in the brain and body when leaders face rapid change or high stakes or a lot of uncertainty. And so this brings us to big idea number 4, which is that a leader's nervous system is their most important leadership tool. And the way that your mind and your body respond to pressure has a direct and measurable impact on how your team actually performs. So let's begin with the basics. Human beings evolved in environments where threats were physical and immediate. So our nervous system developed a fast response mechanism to detect danger and to mobilize us into action. So neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux has shown that the brain processes potential threats before conscious thought even begins. And so this system kept our ancestors alive, but in modern workplaces, it can create false alarms. So changes in priorities and new technologies and shifting expectations or ambiguous communication, those things can all be interpreted by the nervous system as threats, even when there's no physical danger present. And so when this system activates, it triggers a cascade of psychological reactions. So the amygdala signals the hypothalamus, which mobilizes cortisol and adrenaline. Heart rate increases, breathing becomes shallow, cognitive resources shift from reflective thinking to rapid threat assessment. And Stanford psychologist James Gross describes this as the attention hijack. This is where the brain's executive functioning temporarily shuts down and emotional reactivity takes over. And so in leadership, this shows up as irritability, defensiveness, impulsive decision making, or even withdrawal. And leaders often interpret these reactions as personal shortcomings, but they are biological responses to perceived uncertainty. And so this is especially important in environments shaped by automation and AI. So researchers at UC Davis have examined the relationship between digital acceleration and stress. And what they found is that rapid technology changes create what they call a persistent low-grade threat response. So the uncertainty of learning new systems, adapting to unfamiliar tools, or worrying about the relevance keeps the nervous system in this heightened state. And so when leaders carry this state into conversations, even if it's unintentional, their teams pick up on it through what psychologists call emotional contagion. And emotional contagion is the phenomenon where the emotional state of one person influences the state of others. So social neuroscientist Tanya Singer has shown that humans unconsciously mirror the emotions of people in positions of authority. So when a leader is dysregulated, their team becomes dysregulated. And when a leader is grounded, their team becomes grounded. And this is the biological foundation behind statements like teams borrow their leader's nervous system. It is not metaphorical, it's measurable. And so functional MRI studies by Naomi Eisenberger at UCLA provide additional evidence to this. So when individuals experience social uncertainty or a fear of negative evaluation, the same neural circuits activate as when they experience physical pain. And so this means that unclear communication, unpredictable changes, or emotionally unavailable leadership, all of these things create very real stress responses. And for teams to navigate constant technological shifts, chronic exposure to these stressors reduces their cognitive flexibility. It slows their learning and it undermines their problem-solving ability. And so this is why the inner game of leadership matters just as much as the outer game, because leaders often focus on what they say and the decision that they make. And the science shows that how they show up biologically has equal, if not greater, influence. And so a leader who can regulate their nervous system during periods of change creates psychological safety without having to talk about psychological safety. Their presence signals that stability. So their steadiness reduces threat responses in their teams. Their clarity restores cognitive capacity in the people around them. So the question becomes, how do leaders build this kind of presence? And the answer lies in understanding the connection between inner regulation and outer effectiveness. And so this brings us to unified leadership, which is the model that integrates emotional steadiness with strategic execution. And so on the next slide, we'll explore why unifying these two domains is the key to leading effectively in the digital world. All right, so now that we've explored how the nervous system shapes leadership under pressure, I want to introduce the core concept that sits at the heart of Unity & Company's philosophy. And this is what we call unified leadership. And it represents the integration of two distinct but inseparable parts of leadership, which is the inner game and the outer game. So unified leadership is the practice of aligning who you are internally with how you lead externally, so that your presence, your decisions, communication, and actions, they all reinforce trust, clarity, and stability. So let's start with the inner game. So the inner game includes your emotional regulation, your ability to stay grounded, your clarity about your values, your awareness of your patterns under stress, and your capacity to respond rather than to react. It's the part of leadership that's invisible. So nobody sees it, but everyone feels it. Inner game competencies determine how you show up when things get difficult. They determine whether you can stay centered during ambiguity or whether pressure leads you to default to urgency, control, withdrawal, or reactivity. And so the outer game is what people traditionally associate with leadership. So that includes things like strategy, execution, communication, performance management, decision making, and the systems that guide how people think. And the outer game is measurable and it's visible. And it's where leaders set direction, they create structure, they drive results. Strong outer game shows up through clarity of vision, effective communication, and consistent follow through. But what most leaders learn only through experience is that these two domains cannot be separated, at least not effectively. So when the inner game is weak, the outer game suffers. When stress overrides emotional regulation, communication becomes less clear, decisions become more reactive, and execution becomes more fragmented. So teams feel this immediately. They may not be able to articulate it necessarily, but they sense when a leader's internal state does not match the external demands of the moment. Now, the inverse is also true. So when inner game is strong, then the outer game improves. So leaders communicate with more clarity. They handle pressure with steadiness. They make decisions with more precision. They use their authority not to create urgency, but to create alignment. And their presence reduces the emotional noise in the system, which improves performance up and down the org chart. And so this idea is supported by research across multiple fields. So organizational psychologist Robert Kegan's work on adult development shows that leaders who can regulate their internal reactions and operate from a more self-authored mindset, they create more adaptive teams. And then research from the Center for Creative Leadership has found that the most common derailers of otherwise capable executives stem from emotional patterns rather than technical gaps. And so executives fail not because they lack intelligence, but because they become reactive, they become defensive, rigid, or disconnected under pressure. And unified leadership addresses this by helping leaders to build the internal capacity to match the external complexity of their roles. It's a recognition that in an age of automation, where environment changes faster than humans can, leaders need to build the ability to stay present and grounded. Because without that grounding, strategy and systems are just not enough. Technical excellence cannot compensate for emotional fragility at the top of the system. And this integration becomes even more important in AI-enabled environments. When leaders unify inner steadiness with outer clarity, then teams adopt new tools faster. They work with less friction. They engage with more creativity. And when leaders don't do this, the organization's emotional load increases, even if the technology itself is intended to create efficiency. So as we move forward, let's keep this in mind. Unified leadership is not a style. It's a requirement for leading in environments defined by rapid change. The inner game stabilizes the system. The outer game steers it. Both matter, and the leaders who integrate them will outperform those who rely only on one domain. Now, next, we'll look at the specific human skills that will matter most in the decade ahead and how they connect to this unified approach to leadership. Okay, so now that we've established what unified leadership is and why it matters in a rapidly changing environment, we can move into a practical question. So what skills will actually differentiate leaders over the next decade? Now, if we accept that technology will continue to accelerate and that human capacity is the true bottleneck here, then the skills that matter most are the ones that enhance trust, clarity, collaboration, and emotional steadiness. And these are not soft skills. These are the capabilities that determine whether teams adapt or whether they ultimately struggle. So let's begin with emotional presence. So emotional presence refers to a leader's ability to stay centered, aware, and responsive in real time, especially in moments of pressure. So research from the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence shows that when leaders demonstrate emotional presence, employees report higher engagement, better decision-making, and stronger feelings of psychological safety. And this is because emotional presence signals that the leader is attentive, is stable, and is able to process information without being overwhelmed by it. And in environments shaped by automation and constant change, that emotional presence becomes the anchor that keeps teams from sliding into anxiety or confusion. And so the second capability is sense making. Um, as automation increases the volume of information that teams have to process, leaders have to become skilled interpreters or curators of that information. So, sense making involves gathering input, identifying the patterns, clarifying what matters, and then translating complexity into direction. So, when Carl Wick, one of the leading scholars on organizational sense making, he did some research and he argues that the ability to create shared meaning during uncertainty is one of the most critical functions of leadership. So AI can generate data, but only humans can turn data into a coherent narrative. Leaders who excel at sense making help teams to understand not just what's happening right now, but why it matters and how to respond. So another skill is psychological safety in leadership. And so psychological safety is the belief that people can speak up, ask questions, or admit uncertainty without fear of negative consequence or judgment. And so Amy Edmondson's research has shown that psychological safety is the strongest predictor of team performance in environments requiring learning and adaptability, which is all of our work environments. And so this becomes even more important as organizations introduce new technologies, because when employees feel psychologically safe, they experiment more, they surface problems earlier, and they adopt new tools with less resistance. So leaders create psychological safety through curiosity, through transparency, and through consistency. It's not about being permissive. It's about creating conditions where people can contribute fully. And so the next capability is transparent and steady communication. So research from MIT's Human Dynamics Lab has shown that effective communication patterns, especially during periods of change, drive measurable improvements in team cohesion and performance. So in AI-enabled environments, the pace of communication increases, but clarity often decreases. So leaders who communicate with steadiness and transparency reduce uncertainty and build trust. They set expectations clearly. They narrate their reasoning, they separate facts from assumptions, and they reduce the emotional load on the system by being predictable and clear. And so another essential capability here is ethical judgment. So as AI becomes more integrated into decision-making processes, leaders have to navigate questions of privacy and fairness and responsible use. So the World Economic Forum and the Institute for the Future have both emphasized ethical leadership as a top skill for the next decade. Ethical judgment requires empathy, foresight, and a strong inner compass. It also requires the ability to balance efficiency with humanity, especially when using technologies that affect people's livelihoods or sense of fairness. And so finally, we come to coaching. So coaching is no longer a specialty. It's a core leadership function. Research from the International Coaching Federation and McKinsey shows that organizations with strong coaching cultures outperform in retention and engagement and adaptability. So as automation takes over routine tasks, leaders have to shift from directing to developing people. So coaching builds autonomy, it strengthens problem solving, and empowers teams to navigate complexity independently. So these skills are not separate from unified leadership, they're expressions of it. So emotional presence comes from inner regulation, sense making comes from cognitive clarity, psychological safety comes from relational steadiness, coaching comes from both curiosity and discipline. These are the capabilities that will define the next generation of high performing leaders. And so next, we're going to look at the evolving partnership between humans and AI and what it means for your role as a leader in the digital world. All right, so as we move deeper into what leadership requires in the digital world, I want to turn our attention to the relationship between humans and AI within organizations. So this brings us to big idea number 3, which is that AI changes what you do, but emotional intelligence changes how people feel while you're doing it. And this distinction matters because technological adoption is no longer just a technical challenge. It's an emotional and relational challenge that lives squarely in the domain of leadership. So let's begin with what AI actually does well. AI excels at pattern recognition. It excels at speed. It excels at consistency. So a study from the Wharton School found that AI systems can analyze complex data sets more than 20 times faster than human analysts and with higher predictive accuracy in many cases. So these capabilities create enormous opportunities for innovation and efficiency and strategic insight. AI can process thousands of variables in seconds, But what it can't do is understand human context. It can't really interpret human emotions or assess how a decision will be received by real people working in real environments. And so this gap is where leadership becomes essential, because research from the Boston Consulting Group compared AI-enabled teams across dozens of organizations, and they found that the top performing teams were not the ones with the most advanced tools. They were the ones with the most human-centered leadership. And in these teams, leaders communicated clear expectations, they helped employees understand the purpose of AI tools, and provided emotional support during the learning curve. Now, teams with low quality leadership just struggled, even when the technology itself was super sophisticated. And this illustrates a powerful truth, which is that AI's success depends on human trust. Trust becomes especially important because AI introduces new forms of uncertainty. So employees often worry about job security, irrelevance, or being replaced. And a recent CIPD survey found that nearly half of employees exposed to automation report concerns about long-term career stability. Now, these concerns don't always surface in conversations, but they do influence behavior. People may hesitate to adopt new tools, to resist workflow changes, or become less engaged. And leaders need to recognize these emotional dynamics early and address them with clarity and empathy. So, in environments where AI adoption is high, leaders must also pay attention to fairness and transparency. Researchers at the Alan Turing Institute emphasize that perceived fairness in AI-driven processes determines whether employees trust the outputs. So if people believe an algorithm is opaque or if it's biased, they disengage from that system. So leadership plays a really central role here. Leaders do not need to understand necessarily the technical workings of every model, but they do need to explain how decisions are made, what safeguards exist, and how the organization approaches responsible AI use. So this strengthens psychological safety and reduces speculation. Now, we also know from neuroscience that human beings respond differently to decisions made by people versus decisions made by technology. So a study published by the journal Nature Human Behavior showed that individuals are more sensitive to perceived injustice when they believe a machine contributed to the decision. So this finding matters for leaders implementing AI in performance management, in hiring, or in resource allocation, because it means that leaders must provide human context and relational connection to temper the emotional impact of AI-supported decisions. So when we look at organizations that get this right, a consistent pattern starts to emerge. Leaders frame AI as a partner rather than a threat. They describe how technology enhances human judgment rather than replacing it. And they invest in training not only to teach the tool, but to deepen confidence. So they create forums where teams can ask questions, express concerns, and share ideas. And they anchor the narrative in growth and opportunity and evolution. So research from Deloitte's Human Capital Trends Report confirms this. Organizations that combine technological investment with human-centered leadership, they outperform their peers in productivity and engagement and in innovation. And none of this is accidental. It's the result of leaders who understand that technology adoption is emotional before it's operational. It's shaped by trust before it's shaped by efficiency. And it succeeds only when people feel supported, valued, and included. AI might change the architecture of work, but leaders determine the emotional climate in which that change unfolds. And so this brings us to the practical side of today's conversation. So if we know what the future demands and how human and technological systems interact, then the next question is, what does effective leadership look like over the next 90 days? What behaviors can you adopt now to create stability, clarity, and trust during periods of digital transformation? And that's where we're headed next. All right, so before we move into the closing section, I want to bring everything together. So we've covered a lot of ground today, and so it's important to distill the core messages into a set of principles that you can carry with you long after the session ends. So here are the 5 big ideas that define human leadership in a digital world. And together, all of these things form a blueprint for leading through complexity and technological disruption. So the first idea is that technology is accelerating faster than human capacity. And this frames the entire modern leadership landscape. So a wide range of global institutions, including the OECD and the World Economic Forum, continue to highlight the widening adaptation gap that technology creates. And leaders and teams are asked to absorb change at a pace that outstrips human biology. And this idea explains the stress, the overload attention, and the rising sense of instability that many employees are actually experiencing during this digital transformation phase. And so it's not a failure of effort or a failure of intent. It's the natural result of environment shifting faster than the human nervous system can adapt. And so recognizing this gap is the first step towards leading with more empathy and precision. Now, the second big idea is that emotional intelligence has become a performance multiplier. So the research on this is extensive and really clear. When environments are stable, technical skills dominate performance outcomes. And when environments are volatile, emotional intelligence dominates because it governs how people communicate, how they collaborate, and how they handle ambiguity. And so when we look at Google's research on high performing teams, and then Dan Goldman's body of work on EQ, or even Richard Boyatzie's studies on emotional attractors in leadership, the conclusion is consistent. Emotional intelligence is not optional. It drives productivity, innovation, learning, and retention. It shapes how teams experience change and how quickly they adapt to it. All right, now the third big idea is that AI changes what you do, but EQ changes how people feel while they're doing it. And so this principle captures the essential human-technology relationship. AI excels at speed, precision, and scale. And what it does not understand are the emotional, social, and relational dynamics of real workplaces. And so research from the Boston Consulting Group and the Alan Turing Institute has shown that the success of AI initiatives depends far more on leadership trust and communication than on the sophistication of the tool itself. Leaders set the emotional context in a world where AI is adopted. And the tool may be technical, but the adoption piece, that's human. Now, the fourth big idea is that your nervous system is your most important leadership tool. And modern neuroscience has made this unmistakably clear. So under pressure, the brain shifts into a threat response that narrows cognitive capacity. And leaders who cannot regulate their internal state inadvertently transmit that stress to their teams. And so this emotional contagion affects performance, learning, and morale. And so leaders who stay grounded and steady and emotionally regulated, they create the psychological safety that their team needs before they even speak. And their presence restores clarity and capacity in the people around them. These four ideas build towards a fifth idea, which is that unified leadership is the new standard for leading in the digital world. So unified leadership integrates the inner game and the outer game. It combines emotional regulation with strategic clarity, self-awareness, and communication, and grounded presence with decisive execution. So research from the Center of Creative Leadership and adult development theorists like Robert Keegan reinforce this point. Leaders derail not because they lack technical competence, but because their inner capacity does not match the outer complexity of their environment. Unified leadership closes that gap. So these five ideas, they're not abstract theories. They're practical and deeply connected to what leaders are facing every day in today's environment. And they explain why some teams thrive through change and others just fracture and struggle. They explain why some leaders can guide teams through uncertainty while others become reactive or overwhelmed by it. And most importantly, it explains where leadership is headed. So with that foundation in place, let's turn to our final slide and explore what you can do next and how Unity can support you in building these capabilities within your team and your organization. All right, so as we come to the end of today's session, I want to bring us back to the reason this topic matters, which is that leadership has always been about people, but in a digital world, that truth becomes even more important. AI can scale output and analyze data and streamline workflows, but it can't replace the emotional steadiness, the clarity, or the presence of a capable leader. And technology can transform how work gets done, but only human beings can create the conditions where people feel safe and committed and willing to grow through the change. So everything that we explored today points to a single conclusion, and that's that the future of leadership is human-centric by necessity, not by preference. We're entering an era where technical expertise is table stakes, but human capability is the true differentiator. So leaders who excel will be the ones who stay grounded in the midst of complexity, the ones who communicate with clarity even when information is incomplete, or the ones who create trust during moments of uncertainty, and the people who can guide their teams through change without amplifying fear or instability. Now, these aren't outdated leadership ideals. They're the leadership skills that will determine whether organizations adapt or fall behind in the years ahead. So the 5 big ideas that we discussed today can serve as your anchor. Technology is going to continue to accelerate. Emotional intelligence will continue to rise in importance. And AI will continue to reshape workflows and decision making. The nervous system will continue to be the engine behind leadership presence. And unified leadership will continue to be the model that integrates the inner game and the outer game into a coherent way of leading. And when these ideas are applied intentionally, they transform not only how leaders think, but how teams feel and how organizations perform. And this is the work that we do here at Unity and Company. So our mission is to help leaders and teams build the capabilities that they need to thrive in environments shaped by complexity and change. So whether through leadership development programs, team effectiveness work, strategic facilitation, or executive coaching, our focus is always on strengthening the human side of performance. So we bring research and experience and practical tools, and all these things are designed to elevate both the inner and the outer game of leadership. And we work with leaders at every level, from high-performing frontline managers to senior teams and C-suite leaders who are navigating the pressures of large-scale transformation. And so for those of you who want to go deeper, there are a couple of ways that we can support you. So we offer leadership development programs tailored to the specific challenges your organization is facing. So from psychological safety to communication to building strong leadership pipelines, and a whole lot more. And we support teams who want to increase trust and alignment and collaboration so that they can move faster and with less friction. So we provide executive coaching for leaders who want personalized support in developing the internal steadiness and the external clarity that they need to lead in certain environments. And soon we're going to be launching the Unity Leadership Collective, which is a new community designed to support ongoing growth, connection, and learning for leaders who are committed to building healthier and more human-centered organizations. And most importantly, if something in today's session resonated with you, or if you're thinking about your own team and the challenges that they're facing, I'd love to continue the conversation with you. So we're always happy to schedule an insights call to explore what's happening inside your organization and to identify opportunities to strengthen leadership capability and team performance. I want to thank you all for spending this time with me today. Thank you for your curiosity and your engagement. And your commitment to leading in a way that honors both the people that you serve and the future that we're all building together, because the digital world will continue to evolve. Technology will continue to advance, but the leaders who succeed are going to be the ones who stay grounded, human, and unified in how they show up. And I hope today provided clarity, perspective, and inspiration as you continue along your leadership journey. So let's stay connected and let us know how we can support you in taking the next step.